The night was dark and the highway was deserted as my girlfriend and I drove home from a weekend getaway. We were enjoying the silence and solitude of the road, lost in our thoughts and the occasional conversation. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a car appeared in our rearview mirror. It was an old, beat-up sedan, and it was tailgating us dangerously close. I tried to speed up and shake the car off, but it only seemed to make things worse. The sedan continued to pursue us relentlessly, swerving and honking its horn as if to intimidate us. My girlfriend and I exchanged nervous glances, wondering who was behind the wheel and why they were behaving so erratically. As we drove further down the road, the car's headlights began to flicker and dim, as if its battery was failing. I hoped that this would be the end of our ordeal, but instead, the sedan suddenly lurched forward and rammed into the back of our car. We spun out of control, barely managing to keep the car on the road. When we finally came to a stop, we were both shaking and scared out of our minds. We got out of the car to assess the damage, but there was none. It was as if the sedan had vanished into thin air. We got back in the car and drove on, our hearts pounding with fear. But as we continued down the highway, we soon realized that the sedan was still with us. We could hear its engine revving, its headlights flashing in the rearview mirror, even though there was no car in sight. We tried to speed up and lose it again, but it was no use. The car continued to pursue us, always just out of sight, but never letting us forget its presence. We knew we had to get away from it, but we didn't know how. As we approached a long, dark tunnel, we saw the sedan's headlights disappear inside. We hesitated for a moment, wondering if we should follow, but ultimately decided to take our chances and drive through. It was a decision we would soon regret. As soon as we entered the tunnel, we were plunged into darkness. The only light came from our own headlights, and the shadows seemed to move and twist around us, as if alive. Suddenly, a figure appeared in front of us, standing in the middle of the road. It was a man, or at least, it looked like a man, but his eyes were glowing red, and he seemed to be wearing some kind of mask or helmet. My heart is pounding as we speed down the highway, trying to put as much distance between us and the masked man as possible. My mind races, trying to make sense of what we just saw. Who was that man? Why was he wearing a mask? And why was he following us? As we drive, I keep glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the masked man's car behind us. But the road is empty, and the only sound is the hum of the engine and our own panicked breathing. After what feels like hours, we come across a small gas station. It's the only sign of civilization we've seen for miles, and we pull in, hoping to find help. As we step out of the car, I notice that the gas station looks old and abandoned. There's no one around, no lights on, and the pumps are rusted and worn. It's eerie and unsettling, and I feel a chill run down my spine. Suddenly, we hear a noise from inside the gas station. It's a low, guttural sound, like an animal growling. My partner and I exchange a terrified glance and slowly inch towards the door. As we push it open, we're hit by the stench of decay and rot. Inside, the gas station is a mess of overturned shelves, broken glass, and spilled oil. And in the corner, we see something that makes our blood run cold. It's the masked man, slumped against the wall, surrounded by empty cans and bottles. But he's not alone. There are other figures in the shadows, moving and shifting, whispering and hissing. We back away, trying to escape, but the door slams shut behind us, trapping us inside. And as we turn around, we realize that we're not alone. The masked man and his companions are all around us, closing in with inhuman speed and hunger in their eyes. I scream, but no sound comes out. My partner tries to fight back, but it's no use. We're outnumbered and outmatched, and soon we're swallowed up by the darkness. The last thing I see before I'm consumed is the masked man's face, twisted in a grin of pure evil. And I know that we were never meant to make it out alive. Somehow, all I remember next is waking on the hospital bed. Something wasn't right. I kept replaying the events of that night over and over again in my head. The man in the mask, the mysterious car chasing us, the crash. It was all so surreal. After a few hours, a nurse came into the room to check on us. "Thank God you're both okay," she she said with relief in her voice. "The police found you on the side of the road, and you were both in pretty bad shape." "What happened?" I asked, my voice hoarse from the screaming and crying. "We're not sure," she replied, looking at us with concern. "You were both found unconscious, and your car was totaled. But don't worry, you're safe now." The next few days were a blur of pain medication and doctors coming in and out of the room. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was still off, that we were being watched. My girlfriend didn't seem to notice, but I couldn't shake off the feeling. It wasn't until we were released from the hospital and went back home that the pieces started to come together. As we walked up the front steps of our house, I noticed a piece of paper tucked into the door. It was a note, written in scrawled handwriting. "I'll be watching you," it read. My girlfriend saw the note and screamed. We called the police, but they couldn't find any evidence of anyone breaking in or tampering with our house. They told us to be on the lookout and to call if anything else happened. But the note wasn't the worst part. As we settled back into our routine, I couldn't help but feel like we were being watched. Every time I went to work or left the house, I couldn't shake off the feeling that someone was following us. And every time I turned around, there was no one there. It's been a few weeks since the accident, and I still can't shake off the feeling that we're being watched. The note is still tucked away in our kitchen drawer, a constant reminder of what happened that night. We try to go about our lives as normally as possible, but the fear never quite goes away. I don't know who or what was chasing us that night, but I know one thing for sure: I never want to experience anything like it again. Let's hop on to story number 2, but before I begin reading, make sure that you have subscribed to Mr. Scare for regular horror podcasts. I've been driving for hours on this deserted highway, trying to find the next town to fill up my gas tank. It was getting late, and I was starting to get tired, so when I saw the turnoff for a small town, I figured I'd take it. I should have known better. As soon as I entered the town, I knew something was off. It was like I had stepped back in time to the 1950s or something. All the buildings were old-fashioned, and there were no modern cars in sight. I thought maybe I had taken a wrong turn, but when I tried to turn around, I found that the road I had come in on had disappeared. I was starting to feel uneasy when I noticed a group of people standing in the street, watching me intently. They were all dressed in old-fashioned clothes, and they looked like they hadn't seen a new face in years. As I drove by, I could hear them whispering to each other, and I swear I heard my name being mentioned. I tried to find a gas station, but every street I turned down seemed to lead me right back to the same place. The town was like a maze, and I felt like I was trapped. As I drove past an old diner, I saw an old woman staring at me through the window. She had a creepy smile on her face, and I could feel her eyes following me as I drove by. I shuddered and kept driving. Eventually, I found a small hotel and decided to spend the night. The hotel was old and musty, and the room I was given had a strange smell to it. I tried to settle in for the night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't until later that night that things got really creepy. I woke up to the sound of someone knocking on my door. I got up to answer it, but when I opened the door, no one was there. I thought maybe it was just my imagination and went back to bed. But then I heard the knocking again, louder this time. I opened the door, but again there was no one there. I was starting to get really scared now. As I lay in bed, I could hear footsteps outside my door, pacing back and forth. And then I heard a voice whisper my name, and I knew I had to get out of there. I got dressed and went to the front desk to check out, but the old man behind the counter just stared at me with a blank expression. He wouldn't even speak to me. I ran out of the hotel and back to my car, but when I turned the key, the engine wouldn't start. I was stuck in that creepy town. That's when I saw them. The same group of people from earlier, standing in the street watching me. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. One of them was holding a photo of me, a photo that I had never seen before. I knew then that I had to get out of there, but the car wouldn't start. I was trapped, surrounded by those creepy, old-fashioned people. And then I saw her. The old woman from the diner, smiling at me with her creepy smile. And then she started to walk towards me. I don't remember much after that. All I know is that I woke up in my car, parked on the side of the highway. My gas tank was full, and there was no sign of the creepy town or its inhabitants. I still have no idea what happened that night, but I'll never forget that feeling of being watched by those creepy, old-fashioned people. My heart was racing as the old woman walked towards me, her eyes locked on mine. I was frozen, unable to move as she approached, step by slow step. Her skin was like parchment, and her hair was a mess of white tangles. As she came closer, I could see that her eyes were almost completely white, with just a sliver of black in the middle. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't obey me. I was trapped, alone in this eerie, silent town with this strange woman slowly closing in on me. Just as she was about to reach me, a voice called out from behind her. "Leave him be, mother," the voice said. I turned to see a man, tall and thin, standing a few yards away. He was dressed in clothes that looked like they were from another era, a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat. He looked at me with piercing eyes, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. The old woman stopped in her tracks and turned to face the man. "But he's one of us," she said in a creaky voice. The man shook his head. "No, he's not. He's just passing through. We don't want any trouble, do we?" I wanted to scream at him. I was in trouble already, just being here. But I said nothing, just watched as the man and the old woman had a whispered conversation. After a moment, the man turned back to me. "I apologize for my mother," he said. "She can be a bit eccentric, but she means no harm." I nodded, still too afraid to speak. The man gestured for me to follow him, and I did, feeling like a lamb being led to slaughter. We walked through the silent streets, the only sounds the crunch of our footsteps on the gravel road. As we walked, I noticed that there were other people in this town, all of them watching us with interest. They were dressed like the man in old-fashioned clothes, with strange, almost blank expressions on their faces. It was like they were all part of some bizarre cult. We arrived at a small building that looked like a church. The man pushed open the door and gestured for me to enter. Inside, it was dark and musty, with flickering candles casting eerie shadows on the walls. I could smell incense burning and hear the sound of chanting. The man led me to the front of the room, where a group of people were gathered. They all turned to look at me, and I saw that they were holding candles and wearing strange robes. The man stepped forward and began to speak in a language I didn't recognize. It sounded like Latin or some other ancient tongue. I wanted to run, but I was trapped. The people around me were watching me intently, their eyes fixed on me like I was some kind of sacrificial lamb. And then, something changed in the air, a chill that seemed to come from nowhere. I heard a low moaning sound, like the wind, and then a figure appeared at the back of the room. It was a woman, dressed in white, with her face covered by a veil. She glided towards me, and I could see that her skin was pale and translucent. She reached out a hand to touch me, and I felt a surge of terror. And then, I woke up. It was all just a dream, thank God. But the memory of that eerie town, and the strange people who lived there, stayed with me for a long time. I was driving down a dark and winding road late at night, just trying to get home after a long day at work. The only light came from my headlights, casting a narrow beam of illumination on the road ahead of me. I was feeling exhausted and a little bit on edge, as the shadows cast by the trees and bushes alongside the road seemed to be moving and shifting in an eerie way. That's when I saw something in the distance, a dark figure that seemed to be standing in the middle of the road. As I got closer, I realized that it was a person, dressed in dark clothing and standing perfectly still. I hit the brakes and came to a stop just a few feet away from the figure. But when I looked closer, there was no one there. The road was completely empty. I checked my rearview mirror and saw nothing but darkness behind me. I felt a chill run down my spine, wondering if I was losing my mind. I shook it off and continued driving. But as I drove on, I kept seeing the same figure in my headlights, always standing in the middle of the road, always disappearing when I got closer. It was like the figure was teasing me, taunting me, playing with my mind. I tried to convince myself that it was just my tired brain playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. And then, just as suddenly as the figure had appeared, it vanished completely. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but that relief was short-lived. Because just a few minutes later, I saw the figure again, this time standing on the side of the road, just off to the right. And then it disappeared once again. I was starting to feel like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare, unable to escape this endless cycle of seeing the same figure over and over again. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my palms were slick with sweat. As I drove on, I started to notice that the figure seemed to be getting closer and closer. I could see it more clearly now, and it looked like a woman, dressed in a long, flowing dress that billowed in the wind. Her hair was wild and tangled, and her eyes glowed in the darkness. I tried to tell myself that it was just a hallucination, that there was no way this was real. But deep down, I knew that I was facing something much more terrifying than my own imagination. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled over to the side of the road and got out of my car, hoping to confront the figure and put an end to this nightmare once and for all. But as soon as I stepped out of the car, I knew that I had made a mistake. The figure was right in front of me, and this time she didn't disappear. She reached out and grabbed my arm with her cold, bony fingers, and I felt a surge of terror shoot through me. I tried to pull away, but she was too strong. She pulled me closer, and I could smell the stench of decay on her breath. And then she spoke, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper. "Welcome to my world," she said. "You'll never leave now." And then she pulled me into the darkness, and I knew that I was lost forever. I had always heard stories about the dangers of driving on remote highways, but I never thought it would happen to me. I was driving home from a long day of work, taking my usual route, when I noticed a car in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought nothing of it, assuming it was just another driver heading in the same direction. But as I continued on my way, the car stayed behind me, never veering off or overtaking me. I began to feel uneasy, wondering why this car was following me. My unease turned into fear when I saw the car's occupants. They were a group of menacing-looking men, their faces twisted into sneers as they glared at me from their car. I tried to shake them off, speeding up and slowing down, taking turns and exits, but they stayed right behind me. After what felt like hours of driving, I finally saw a gas station up ahead. I made a sharp turn into the parking lot, hoping to lose the pursuers in the confusion. But they were quick to follow, their car screeching to a stop next to mine. The men got out, looking even more menacing up close, their eyes cold and calculating. I quickly locked my car doors, feeling trapped and helpless. One of the men came to my window, tapping on it with a crowbar. "Get out of the car, boy," he said in a gruff voice. "We just want to have a little chat with you." I knew that wasn't true. I could feel the malice and hatred emanating from them. I refused to get out of the car, hoping that someone would come to my rescue. But the gas station was empty, and there was no sign of anyone else around. The men grew impatient, banging on my car with their fists and crowbars. I could hear the metal bending and groaning under the force. And then, suddenly, the sound stopped. I looked up to see the men running away, their faces contorted with fear. Confused and relieved, I looked around to see what had scared them off. And that's when I saw it. A figure, tall and dark, looming over the gas station. Its eyes glowed red, and its body was covered in what looked like fur. It was a creature straight out of nightmares. I tried to drive away, but my car wouldn't start. I was stuck there, at the mercy of this terrifying creature. It seemed to be playing with me, moving closer and closer to my car, never quite touching it. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished into the night. I was shaken and terrified, but somehow, my car started up again. I quickly drove away from the gas station, feeling like I had narrowly escaped death. I never found out what that creature was, or why those men were after me. But I knew one thing for sure: I would never drive on a remote highway again. I was driving home from a weekend trip with my two friends, Sarah and John. We were on a long and winding road through the woods, surrounded by trees that blocked out the moonlight. Suddenly, in the distance, I saw a group of figures standing in the middle of the road. I slowed down, trying to make out what they were. They appeared to be humanoid in shape, but their skin was a sickly gray color, and they had long, sharp claws. As we got closer, I could see that their eyes were glowing a bright red. I hit the brakes and came to a stop, the headlights shining on the group of creatures. Sarah and John both gasped in shock as they saw what was in front of us. "What the hell are those things?" John whispered, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I replied, my heart pounding in my chest. "But we need to get out of here." I started to back up the car, but one of the creatures stepped forward and let out a guttural growl. Its sharp teeth glinted in the dim light, and I could see that its breath was hot and steamy. I put the car into drive and hit the gas, trying to plow through the group of creatures. But they moved with inhuman speed, leaping out of the way and swarming around the car. One of them slammed into the passenger side window, leaving a huge crack in the glass. Sarah screamed as the creature dug its claws into the metal frame and tried to pull itself inside. I swerved the car from side to side, trying to shake them off, but they clung to us like leeches. The creatures seemed to be working together, trying to trap us on the road. Just when I thought we were done for, a bright light shone down from above, illuminating the road and the creatures. The creatures hissed and snarled, covering their eyes with their claws. The light grew brighter and brighter until it was blindingly intense. I felt a sense of weightlessness, as if we were being lifted up into the sky. When I regained my senses, we were lying on the ground outside of the car. The creatures were nowhere to be seen, and the woods were quiet and still. Sarah and John were both unconscious, but alive. I checked their pulses and found that they were both stable. I looked up at the sky and saw a bright, pulsing light in the distance. We were rescued by a group of government officials who explained that they had been tracking the creatures for years, and that they had finally managed to capture them. The officials wouldn't say where the creatures came from or what they were planning to do, but they assured us that they were no longer a threat. Even though we were rescued, the memory of those creatures still haunts me to this day. I'll never forget the fear and terror that I felt on that long and winding road through the woods.